Hey guys, let's talk about how our biases can influence us. Have you ever heard somebody say, I just hate that kind of music, I can't stand it? And then other people might say, well, I just don't care for that. It tells us a lot about how emotionally charged we are as people, kind of our personalities. And sometimes it's just a preference. We could just kind of let it go. And I started talking about that earlier this week when I discussed low fat versus low carb diets. And I tried to get into some of the specifics, but I wanted to make a bigger point about how we consume research. And the funny thing is, I got a lot of different responses on both of those tracks. Interestingly, offline, I got a lot of private questions about this or that and this nuance and what about this. And then online, I was just getting a lot of rah-rah stuff where people kind of fell into the trap I was arguing against, which was, let's not just jump on a bandwagon because somebody's leading the charge. So it reminded me a little bit of just how different we can be, or how we can even interpret things differently. The same study, we might look at the exact same study and maybe even with a good level of experience and judgment about that topic, walk away with some different information, walk away with a different conclusion. So it kind of reminded me just how differently something can sound to different ears. So this is just kind of a clean bass. I like a hollow body bass because it's just kind of a deeper resonance, so you get that kind of a clean sound. Like I think I attribute that, or at least I associate that with like the Black Keys. So just that really deep. And then sometimes, of course, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, one of my favorite bands, they have a much deeper resonance. So that kind of a sound. But then I also love some of the garage band, kind of grungy sound. Things like Manchester Orchestra. Exact same instrument, totally different ways to play, different styles, different player, obviously not that experienced. But you can see that no matter what we're looking at, there can just be a completely different bias going in, and it takes us into a different element of how we interpret that. So again, where I would come from is just saying, let's just take a step back and make sure we're even looking at the right things. And here's an example. One of the studies I think I mentioned was the Minnesota coronary experiment, which was back in the 60s, kind of carried over to the 70s. They looked at more than 10,000 or right around 10,000 subjects. It's one of those really controlled studies where I said, people who are actually given the food to eat is much better because then it's controlled instead of having up to 30% error in self-reporting. And that study has been under more scrutiny in the last year or two because a lot of people who love the high-fat diet, not necessarily even a ketogenic diet, but people who just want to think that fat is good for us because some sources are natural. So I'm thinking about things like, bacon and butter and those whole foods, not even a saturated versus unsaturated. There are just people who want to say that saturated fat is good for us. And so they're looking, that's their bias. They have that presupposition, and so they're on the prowl looking for information that supports that. They're not looking for objective information. They want to find anything they can latch onto and say, I was right. That's how bad a bias can be. So a lot of people, reporters looking for that controversy, maybe freelance writers who are looking for the most likes and shares and that kind of thing, they said, look, we were lied to. Saturated fat isn't bad. And they point to the Minnesota coronary experiment. But when you go back and look at that, here's what the study was really intended for. They wanted to see saturated fat versus unsaturated. Is there a difference? So on the same amount of calories and the same amount of protein, carbs, and fat. This was not a low carb versus low fat diet, but a lot of people are trying to make it sound like it was. It was just saturated versus unsaturated. And so you had a 50% swing either way. Half the people got this much saturated fat, half the people got this much unsaturated fat. And they said, okay, look, since nobody died of a heart attack in that year, saturated fat isn't bad. Well, in 1 year, how many people in changing a diet are going to have a coronary incident like that? Probably few. But even when you look at the raw data, there was a tremendous difference. I think up to 50% difference in things like LDL based on the saturated fat. So you extrapolate that over a year, and you're definitely going to see, or I'm sorry, take that year and multiply it over a lifetime, you're going to see some changes. But again, people go into that seeing what they want to see, gathering what they want to gather, and you know, you're seeing headlines all across the country misinforming people. And again, there's another side of this where people are saying fat isn't bad. See, a high fat diet is better than a high carb diet. That wasn't even what they looked at. That's not even in the data. And so again, it's not even a valid point when you look at that. That's why I said you have to look at all of the research and change variables. Even that one study, I would not say that proved a lot. I think it was a good study. I love that it had so many subjects. I love that it went for a year. 10,000 subjects, that's amazing. I like that it was controlled with actual food intake. You don't see that very often. But you have to say, okay, they only tested these variables, saturated, unsaturated, that was it. There's a lot more we could do, and so we have to look at it in the context of all of that literature. So let me explain why I prefer a lower fat diet when somebody's trying to lose weight. Number one, you know, the old school stuff, you know, calories. The more fat you consume, there are 2 times the amount of calories per gram. We know that. But most people would be willing to forego that if it works. As long as it works, that's fine. I can eat less. That's a denser food, so it might hold me over longer. My satiety levels would be better, so I'm willing to do that. But then you look at hunger. There's a reason why a high-fat diet, low carb, is just the worst when it comes to compliance. People know this. I had somebody I walked into a business today. I walked into a business, somebody recognized me and said, hey, I love your videos. I've been watching those and this and this. And I just have to tell you that my friend is on a low-carb diet, and it's really helped her. I know you don't like those as much, but it's really helped her. And she mentioned kind of a health malady. And I said, that's great. Sometimes that's important. Dr. Dom down in Florida does all his research on epilepsy and things like that, and for ketogenic diet, stage 4 cancer. If I was in one of those situations, that's what I would do. But here's what's funny. This lady said, well, you know, when she does go off of it and she has some pizza or some of this or some of that, and I said, oh, wait a second. You just told me she was on a low-carb, high-fat diet. What do you mean she's eating carbs? Well, you know, the person that she does this diet with wants her to eat no carbs, but that's impossible. You're going to eat them sometime. And I said, exactly. That's why it's just not even a valid comparison most of the time. I've said this forever. The people who do the best on a low-carb diet are the ones who cheat on it, because you have to. But what if you started out with the premise that let's just do something healthier and better with more consistency? So here's another thing a lot of people don't realize. When you overconsume fat, since it only has about a 3% thermic potential, when you overconsume fat, your body just stores it as fat. That's just the end of it. That's the only thing we can do with it. So any particular meal, as soon as a calorie threshold is met to where we're going to use the amount of nutrients we can for energy at that moment, everything else gets stored. It's either in transition to storage or it's stored. Fat is stored as fat, period. Done. A lot of people think carbs are the same way, that we consume carbs and we automatically convert those carbs to fat. It's just not true. Carbs have a much greater thermic potential, and they're part of the Krebs cycle. So when we consume carbs, we break it down into glucose. Glucose fuels that cellular metabolism, and as physiology professors often say, fat burns in the flames of carbohydrates. So one particular study I reviewed showed that above a normal calorie baseline, subjects who consume 5,000 calories in 1 week, not in one day, 5,000 calories of extra carbs above their baseline, you would think that's got to be all stored as fat, right? It was above what they needed, so they're going to store that as fat. But only 6% of those carbs got stored as fat because the body is so efficient, more efficient at using carbs than fat. So this is an inexhaustible topic, guys. I'm not going to convince you that one thing is better than another. And as I started in this topic over the weekend, there are not that many differences. You can truly have a low-carb, higher-fat diet and still do okay. It's your preference. You can decide what style you like and you're going to be fine. You just have to stick to it, know how to play that instrument that way, and you're going to get results. So I'm not anti-anything. I'm all about having the right tool for the right job and making sure that we can all get there together and make the world a better place, be very kumbaya. But it's really just all about understanding how you could apply it and then being consistent. So hope that helps a little bit, guys. I'm going to continue this topic a little bit because obviously it's controversial. A lot of people don't understand it. There are so many different facets to it. And so we're going to tackle some. So hope you guys hang in there with me, and I appreciate you watching.